So already before the establishment of Israel, there is this theme within Islam of a link between the Jews and the Christians, right? Of what became, the Crusaders and what became the Zionists, right? It's the same thing. And now, of course, it doesn't help that historically, again, the British were helpful to the Zionists. So to them, that's it. That's the evidence that they need.
Yeah.
Now, from the other side of it, I think that progressives disagree with Islamists on virtually everything, except one thing, which is that the current world order, the international order, which is more or less run by Europe and America, needs to be dismantled, right? Most of them are also, coincidentally, not fans of Judeo-Christian morality, right? And so all of Israel becomes a proxy for Western imperialism, for Judeo-Christian triumphalism, the occupation of the human mind, right? You read Nietzsche and, Nietzsche's worldview. Nietzsche hated Christianity. He hated the weak, the slave morality, as he called it, right? That was like shoved into Europe, this noble and amazing and magnificent civilization that conquered lands, and the blonde beast, the barbarian, got like emasculated and weakened by this feminine religion out of Judea, right? He can't stand the Christian church, but where does he trace it back to? He traces it back to the Jews, right?
Yeah.
And Nietzsche ultimately paved the way for Adolf Hitler, who was a fan, because he realized that the problem in Europe or in the West isn't just our, failing institutions and all of these things. It's actually much deeper. It's actually our hearts, our minds have been occupied by these despicable, this alien race, these Jews who brought all this stuff into Europe. So the progressives, who are more or less embodying that kind of worldview, arrive at the same conclusion that the Islamists arrive at, which is that this Anglo-American order, all, chock full of all this Christian Bible Jewish stuff, needs to be dismantled, and we need to be the ones that do it, which, is the same position that radical Muslims are in. So they kind of look on the picket line, so to speak. They look down the line. They're like, oh, you guys are for that. Okay, so let's work together. Strange bedfellows, but they find each other because of the worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Okay. So, thank you for that history and background. And I'm sure there are so many more details we could indulge in. At the end, if we don't get to it on the actual podcast, I'd love to get some resources that you would recommend if someone was curious about digging into the history on this. But give us a brief summary of what happened on October 7th, and then where are we today? It's October 30th right now.
On October 7th. So what's interesting about October 7th, it's never talked about very much in Western media, is that it was a big Jewish holiday. First of all, it was the Sabbath. So it's the day of the week where, even in Israel, where you find a lot of secular Jews, people are off. It's the weekend. 70% of Israel, including secular people, observe the Sabbath in one way or the other, right? They'll bring everybody over on Friday night. They'll have the meals. Sometimes they'll do the candles, but they all observe it. So Saturday morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, Israel's quiet. But it was also a big holiday. It was the last day of almost like the Christmas season in Judaism, right? The high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. And this day in particular is called Simchat Torah, which is the joy of the Torah. And literally, Jews in synagogues all over the world take the scrolls. Every synagogue has the books of Moses in a scroll, and they dance with it, right? It's a celebration of the Bible. It's literally a celebration of the Bible. That's the day that this massacre happened on. And several hundred, the number's still unclear, 300, 400, 500. I've seen numbers as upward of 2,000 Palestinian terrorists early in the morning that Saturday, broke through the fence, came over the fence with paragliders, took boats around the fence on the sea route, and invaded Israel. They didn't invade Israeli military bases. They invaded Israeli towns and cities and went from house to house in those cities for hours, butchering, torturing, raping innocent Israeli civilians, more than 1,400, 1,400 people, and not the men, certainly not only, women and children, and not even big children, like infants. There's a report of a guy. This was just yesterday, who's now come out. He was one of the ones on the Israeli side that went after the carnage to try to clean it up. They found a baby in an oven. I don't even want to say more about it. There's more to that story, but I mean that's the level of sadism that these Palestinian terrorists affiliated with Hamas, an Islamic terror group, committed against these people. I mean, just story after story. And the worst part about it is they filmed it. They filmed all of it. They filmed it on their phones. They filmed it on the phones of the people they killed. And they put it up on social media, on Telegram. They put it up on the Facebook pages of the people they killed. Like they uploaded the video of them killing the person whose Facebook page they posted it to. I mean, just sick. And that happened. There's a whole story here about the failure of the Israeli security establishment to forecast this, to be ready for it, to respond to it. There were places in southern Israel where it took hours and hours and hours for help to arrive. A lot of people died. One of the people who speaks, we mentioned Passages, one of the guys who speaks to a lot of our groups, Amit Walks, tried to fight back, him and a couple other guys from his village, and killed. Horrible stuff. I can't even recount for you the stuff. I've like now said I don't want to see anymore. I don't want to hear anymore. It's too much.
Yeah.
I'm like, my brain is full. And it was a shock. It was a total and complete shock to Israel. Israel's a very strong country. They have to be.
Yeah.
State-of-the-art military, state-of-the-art technology, sensors, drones, right? Everything you can imagine. And it all crumbled right in front of their eyes and in the most horrific way possible. There is a tremendous amount of soul searching happening in Israel right now, that people processing. It's a psychological shock as much as it is a military shock.
Yeah.
And right now, the situation is as follows. There are, on last count, I've seen, it was like 240 Israeli and non-Israeli hostages that were taken that day and brought back to Gaza. They're in there somewhere. This hornet's nest, this little area called the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian area. We could talk more about Gaza if you like. They're in there somewhere. The Israeli military is committed to finding them, liberating them, and to destroying Hamas, or at least destroying its capability to rule in Gaza. Hamas has been ruling there since 2007. It's an Islamic state. It's a little itty-bitty Islamic state, barricaded by Israel, by Egypt. Nobody there is happy. And Israel's finally decided this is not a threat that can kind of be contained and managed, which was the theory before. This is a threat that has to be eradicated. And so there's a war, as a ground war, as we're sitting here talking. Israeli soldiers, Jews, but also Christians and Muslims in this Israeli army, by the way, and I know a number of them, who are fighting for the security of Israel, for the safety of these hostages, and indirectly, weirdly, although no one's going to tell you this, they're fighting for the well-being of the Palestinians who live there, who don't want to be ruled by Hamas, right?
Yeah.
So this is not, we've seen conflicts every couple years, some rockets get thrown, Israel responds. This is a qualitatively different situation, right?
Yeah, so since Israel was a nation in 1946, right? 48 was their official nationhood. And the Muslim countries around them came against them immediately. And in God's providence, they stood. And this tiny little nation grew and grew. And it was fascinating attacks. How is this one? You just said this was kind of unprecedented. How is this unprecedented from what's happened before?
Well, it's the single most Jewish deaths since the Holocaust on a single day, right off the bat, right there, despite all the wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, just in terms of raw numbers, how many killed in a day, it beats them all by a lot. It's also notable for the level of depravity, right? Israel has had wars with Egypt, wars with Jordan, but this kind of ISIS
There's military
style,
conflicts.
yeah, it was like tank shoots tank, like the stuff you would expect. The beheadings, the rapes, the stories, like this is very unusual. Like it's ISIS. I mean, it's ISIS. I don't even think ISIS did some of this stuff. I mean, it is depraved. That is like
That's
another.
kind of, yeah. That's kind of boggled my mind too, because on the one hand, I'm thinking, what kind of support do they think they're going to engender by videoing these things and publishing them and making it known? And yet, at the same time, I hear people who have access to see the truth argue that it's somehow justified, or that it's not true, it's made up, it's all AI generated stuff,
Right.
And it's kind of confusing, because you would think anybody with any sensibility at all would recognize wickedness and evil when they see it. And yet, I think this goes to show the power of a worldview, because at Summit we talk about worldviews being a pattern of ideas, or even like lenses that help you see the world. And if they're the right prescription based on true beliefs of reality in the world, then you see more clearly. But if they're not, if they're false beliefs, then they actually can blind you to reality. What causes a person, and granted, not everyone, and I'm sure there are Muslims that are appalled by this as well, but what causes a people, by and large, to rally behind a group of people who do this? Hamas, a group of terrorists who would do this to another people?
It's a very hard question to answer. I have to be honest.
Yeah, you may not be able to, and it's okay.
No, I'll say a few
thoughts,
things, but I still find a hard time wrapping my own head around it. I think that Israel as a country, just as the Jew as an individual in previous eras, has become the arch villain and scapegoat of the world. In Europe, what was anti-Semitism really about? How did it manifest? Often it manifested as people projecting onto the Jew all of their collective problems, economic problems, political problems. It's the Jews' fault, right? If you're a capitalist, the Jews are communists. If you're communist, the Jews are capitalists, right? They're too rich, they're too poor, they're too religious, not religious enough, right? The Jew is a blank canvas, right? And I think that the aggrieved peoples of the world have done the same thing with Israel, right? It's the Jew of the countries. And in that way, Jews themselves, Israeli Jews, have been dehumanized. I mean, add to that the fact that Hamas, and you could find this all over the internet, videos of little kids saying these things. Hamas has taught, and not just Hamas, like many, let's say, Islamically influenced school curriculums have taught for years their students that Jews are, based on a hadith, a tradition of Islam, Jews are descendants of apes and pigs. Like they're not actually even human, really human. And so you habituate millions of people for decades to dehumanize the Jewish people, to scapegoat and villainize this thing called Israel. And you've created conditions under which it becomes justified to do anything you have to do to, lead the resistance, to decolonize, right? To self-liberate. And I think that's how you get there, right? It's okay to kill a Jew. I mean, we could all agree that Jews are like the problem of behind all the problems, right? A lot of people would nod and say yes to that.
Yeah, so that's very similar to what led to the Holocaust itself. I mean, it's not just a Nazi idea. The idea is broader than Nazism.
I always tell people,
and anytime you dehumanize a people,
anti-Semitism is often lumped together with a lot of hatreds. Oh, okay, hatred of blacks, that's in America racism, or hatred of Jews is not really all that this is about. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, right? There is almost always in an anti-Semitic statement the allegation that there is a much bigger story, right? And that the Jews are behind that story, and they're orchestrating all of our politics, orchestrating the Iraq War and 9/11, right? They did 9/11 and all these. They're behind everything, and for that reason, they are the enemy of all mankind. I mean, it gets cosmic. People, and I personally, and I know you'll understand this as will your audience, there's something spiritual about it.
Yeah.
There's something. How do you get there? Wow. How is it that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Syria in the last 10 years? This is an issue I've worked on. Tried advocating for that issue. You can't get anybody to sit up and pay attention. But, the Jews, you introduce one Jew into that story, international news for years, right? You see 100,000 person marches in London in support of Hamas. After Hamas attacks the Jews, if you saw these things, you would think, oh, the Jews did something. What'd they do? No, all they did was get attacked by surprise. So how do you explain it? I think rationally you can explain it.
Right.
How do you maintain a hatred and a desire to exterminate a single people for centuries in different times and places, different people groups, different situations? There's no rational explanation. There is something special about the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And some people think there's something deeply unspecial about them, but they go together. Everybody understands this is not a normal group of people. Some people take it in a good direction, the biblical myth, and then some people take the anti-myth, which is anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Wow. That's clarifying. Because as Christians, even though as Western Christians, many of us, I think, live like practical naturalists, we would honor the word and say we believe it to be true, but we really live our daily lives by what we see, touch, taste, and feel, and don't practically, probably other than prayer, think in terms of the supernatural. But you start to see this kind of thing, you have to come to terms with the fact that there's something supernatural going on here.
For me, you asked me, how did I come to Christ? It was actually by studying Jewish history. It's such an unlikely story that this little group of people pops onto history's, table and says, we're special. God told us we are. And he said we're going to last forever. And we believe him. And then proceed to live it out, right? Even though everybody tries to kill this group of people. I'm like, and I love history. So I've always been a big history nut.
Yeah.
And this was such an anomaly, such an outlier that I'm like, what's behind this? And that was the thing that ultimately led me to embrace Christianity. Weirdly enough, that was stuff like this.
That's awesome. So, who is Hamas? I mean, where did they come from?
Hamas. So Hamas is an acronym, actually. If it was in English, it'd be like HMS. Hamas is the Islamic Resistance Movement. It is a spin-off of something called the Muslim Brotherhood, which was started in Egypt in the 20th century. And like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas believes that the real solution to our problems, their problems, starts with a spiritual revival. It's actually not unlike what a lot of us talk about in Christianity, right? You want to fix our problems. Our problems are not primarily political. They start in the heart. We need to reform ourselves, our communities, and work our way up and build an authentically, pious Islamic society. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood believes. With that comes something we don't have in Christianity, which is an embrace of jihad, right? Of this idea that not only every state, every king, every country needs to wage war on behalf of the true religion, but individual Muslims, right? And this was an innovation. This was not something that was so common in Islam before that. But all of these things are the things that inspired people like Osama bin Laden, inspired ISIS. They all have a slightly different flavor, but Hamas is very much in the mix. Iran, which is a Shiite country, right? There's some differences within Islam between the Sunni stream, the majority, and the Shiite stream. They hate each other, by the way. But Iran also absorbed some of these same ideas, and it's why it's called the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is why also Iran supports Hamas. Hamas is primarily Sunni. They are Shiite, but they have common cause in their religion, at least at a high level, and in their opposition to Israel and to Zionism. So Hamas started in the late 80s as a response to the secular nationalists, if we can call them that, who were then ruling the Palestinian movement. They were all Muslims, or most of them, but their language, their theories, their strategies were primarily secular in nature, right? They talked about politics and war. Hamas comes on the scene and says, it's deeper than that. It's about religion. We need to liberate Palestine. Okay, yeah, for Palestinians, but really, we're liberating it for God. And this land is consecrated land. This land is holy land. We need to return it back to the God who gave it. They also introduced into the Palestinian context, famously, suicide bombings, right? And they did this a lot in the 90s, early 2000s. And they were the ones understood to be responsible for stalling the peace process. Back before probably most of your listeners were alive in the early 90s, there was a possibility, there was a moment where people thought Israel was going to make peace with the Palestinians. There was going to be some kind of Palestinian state and, two peoples side by side living together in some kind of harmony. Well, Hamas was one of the main groups that frustrated all that by blowing themselves up at Israeli pizza shops and malls and, theaters and things, forcing Israelis to take more security measures, which made the whole peace process more difficult. And they've been ruling in Gaza. So there's two Palestinian territories. There's the West Bank, a much bigger piece of land that's, Jews call it Judea and Samaria. It's kind of the heartland of the Bible. Palestinians rule that. But there's another little piece of land called the Gaza Strip. Now, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from its Palestinian rivals, actually threw a bunch of them off a roof, killed a couple hundred of their own people.
Was that before the 2007 election or after?
Well, the election was in 2006.
Oh,
they won.
Yeah.
You're right to point that out. And then they took over physically, militarily in 2007. It was like the Battle of Gaza, summer 2007. And they've been ruling ever since.
They just pushed out all their rival Palestinian leaders.
Yeah, it was like an intra-Palestinian war.
How did they win the election? Did they have the people that persuaded? I mean, did the Palestinian people really, or was there kind of this, you vote for us or else?
No, it wasn't you vote for us or else. And in fact, they were the weaker party. Really? The United States was so confident that Hamas could never, ever win that it was us, in fact, who pushed elections on them and inadvertently ended up legitimating them because the people went out voluntarily and vote for them. I think their final numbers were 46% or something. Fatah Party, their big rival, the secular nationalist party, they got like 41. So they didn't get like the majority, but they got a plurality. They got enough to win.
Wow.
Okay. And I mean, look, if you look at the numbers today, they're supported more than ever. So why did they come to power? I think part of it is, they told a story to the voters. They said, listen, you've been led by these secular nationalists, and where has it gotten you, right? The Israelis are still as powerful as ever. The Americans, the Europeans, still providing cover for this state more than ever. You're nowhere. You're actually worse off than you've ever been. It's because you're neglecting God. You need to bring God into this. And we're strong, we're tough, we're uncompromising. We reject all this nonsense peace with Israel. Like, we're not doing that. We are going to stay true to our principles. And they spoke in the kind of religious, pious, moral language that got people out, and so they won.
And they're still supported by Palestinian people in the polls, and it's only going up. How does that work with the conditions the Palestinians are living in? All the money that's come in through Hamas's control, and they've not put it to use to make better the lives for the people there.
It's a great question. Part of it is the other leadership has been so much of a failure in Palestinian eyes. It's so corrupt, right? The people who rule the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, it's like a Palestinian government. A lot of people don't know there's an actual Palestinian state.
Yeah.
It's called the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
It has a president, has diplomats, has post offices. I mean, it's like a proper state or quasi-state.
Yeah.
They're terrible. Like any poll you look at, and I look at a lot of these polls, the president is like the most hated person in the survey, right? It's like 80-something% want him to go away. For years now, this guy, and there's been no elections, by the way, since that one in 2006. People are frustrated. That's the short answer to your question. People are frustrated. They see no progress being made. Their streets are still full of potholes. There's no, the hospitals are terrible. They can't move. They can't do anything. And so they start to tell themselves, you know what? This whole negotiation thing, for what? It doesn't get us anywhere. The answer is armed struggle. We got to go back to our roots. And so I'll tell you what, September 13th was the last big survey in the West Bank and Gaza by the main Palestinian polling firm. Mm-hmm. And there was a question on the survey. Mm-hmm. Do you support armed attacks, violence against Israeli civilians inside Israel? And the number of people who said yes was 67%. And this is a survey that's not done on the phone. This is people go house to house. This is like an old-fashioned survey. Very credible, most credible survey organization in the West Bank. And 67%. So like 2 out of the 3 people you'll pull off the street thinks it's okay to go do what Hamas did on October 7th, right? That's where the people are at these days. And the longer that I've done this work, the more radicalized they are becoming, right? There was on that same survey a question, if there was a vote today between the current president, like I said, who everybody hates, and Ismail Haniyeh, who's one of the Hamas leaders, who would you vote for? It's not even close, Ismail Haniyeh. They'd vote for the Hamas guy over the secular national guy because they think he's weak, they think he's corrupt, they think he's in bed with the Israelis, and they want somebody to stick it to their enemies. Hamas is the only one that says and shows that they can do it.
Even though Hamas uses them as shields, even though Hamas, operates out of their homes and their hospitals and all of that, they're willing to tolerate that. So
it's important to point out that on all of these surveys, there's at the low end, a quarter, mm-hmm. an upper end, like a third, sometimes even a little bit more, of Palestinians who would basically vote on these surveys the way you and I might, mm-hmm. right? They're for negotiation. They're for a two-state solution. Yeah. Like they're saying the right things. It's like a third. I always call them like the silent third. Mm. And they do not. I mean, they would sit here and probably nod as you're speaking, like, yeah, they're horrible. They're not good governors. But they have been so conditioned. The Palestinian people have been so conditioned through their schools, through their media. I mean, mm-hmm. talk about worldview, to understand themselves as the victim, mm-hmm. right? To understand the Israelis as the victimizer, to understand that the only real solution is an eradication of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state on top of it, and filled with this idea that by all means necessary, like we will get the occupier, we will get the Zionist enemy, that they are now, especially in like a moment of peak frustration, willing to tolerate whatever they have to see these goals get accomplished. And there's a certain kind of mob mentality too.
Yeah.
People just get whipped up in a frenzy and they get behind things that, on their own, they probably wouldn't get behind.
Right. College, you called it the group stupid factor, but nationally it can be really horrible. So, I mean, it goes to point out the reality that the narratives we believe about our lives and the world we live in really make all the difference. I mean,
totally. I love that you guys focus on that. I think it's brilliant to focus on worldview, because if you get the worldview right, all the other stuff falls into place. And you see how it can go well and how it could go really, really poorly.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine since 1948, when they became a nation, one of the things we've seemed to have, correct me if I'm wrong, but my looking back at the history since then, it seems like the world powers have been unable to recognize this religious fervor and worldview prohibition for there to be a two-state solution. You'd have to be a pretty secular Muslim to go for that. And there's just not a lot of secular Muslims in power there right now.
It's even, I mean, the concept is foreign to that part of the world. Even if you're, like, it's not like here, you're religious, you're not religious, pretty black and white.
Yeah.
93% of Palestinians on these surveys say that they're religious. And they'll say like a lot, a little, but it's like, it's hot, medium, mild. It's not not,
right.
you know? So they may not pray 5 times a day. They may actually be, you know, crappy Muslims, but they believe in that worldview, and they couldn't imagine entertaining anything else or saying, I'm not a Muslim. Now, what you point out though is extremely important. And I have no doubt that anybody listening to this will understand why religion, why spirituality, why worldview makes a difference. And I would hope that there are out there in your audience people who want to go into public service or, you know, go into careers that somehow relate to this, because this is, and honestly, this is what Philos is about, right? Is introducing the hidden dimension, right? The thing that nobody's talking about. I have this podcast called The Deep Map, and anybody who's interested can check it out. And my tagline is exploring the hidden religious and cultural dynamics driving headlines around the world. Because people do things, shockingly, largely because of what they believe to be true about the world. And if you don't get that one thing going into this region, you won't understand anything. You'll think it's about borders and, you know, who gets to control this piece of land and how many refugees get to come. Those are all issues, but they're secondary issues. The primary issues are psychological. They're mythical, right? They're spiritual.
Yeah.
And Westerners have a hard time, Americans more than anyone, in grasping that fact. They think it's, we'll give them more jobs, you know, more economic programming, more social development. It's like, no. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, we're running close on time, and I want to honor the time you're giving us. What are some practical ways that American Christians can engage with this? I mean, so the bulk of our audience have been trained to think in terms of worldview. Many of the younger ones are in college or grad school or young professionals. If they're talking with a classmate or professor, or in that context, it's probably more hostile, but maybe a neighbor or a friend who is buying a false narrative, just doesn't know any better, or hasn't done the diligence to seek to find the truth. How would you instruct them? How would you encourage them to speak the truth in love? And then are there other things they can do other than, of course, as believers, pray for Israel and for the Palestinians that don't desire this?
For sure that. So I sometimes teach Christian response to conflict. So compassion, diligence, discernment, action. That's usually the litany I roll out. So compassion, and this helps a lot when you're talking to people. You should be genuinely a compassionate person who, putting aside ideology, politics, all of that, can recognize the humanity in everyone, right? And I think there are Christians in this space who, you know, could care less what a Palestinian is or what their life is like or what happens to them in the future. I can get that, because there's a lot of bad that's been done from that side to the other. But I told you, there is at least a third, based on public opinion surveys, who are not really into it and don't want to be part of it. They want a normal life. So showing compassion, voicing compassion in a conversation with people, helping them understand that you're not somebody who, you know, just wants to destroy everybody who disagrees with you or with Israel or whomever. That actually goes a long way, I've found. And sometimes people are kind of taken aback, like, oh, wow, okay, I didn't think you would care.
One of our students who actually went on one of the Passages trips to Israel this past June was telling me at his university there's a free speech corner where they've got white billboards up, and it's a conjunction of 3 main spaces on campus. And so when all the students come up there, and somebody will write a word or an idea or something, and then you get these responses, and then people kind of mill around having conversation about it. So he took up a pen shortly after October 7th and wrote in big red letters, "Can you be pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli?" Just to start the conversation of, is there a category for loving people and having compassion and being for the well-being of both when it's so polarized, right? But something similar to that, right? And genuinely loving people.
Yeah, genuinely right. I think I'm pretty sure we're called to do that.
It's in there somewhere.
Now, the mistake, somewhere. The mistake that people make is stopping there. And this is what I always tell Christians. Christians are actually quite good at having compassion for the most part. But oftentimes people use it as an excuse to be like, oh, I don't know, like both sides, like it's all fine. It's
The
not all
relativism
fine,
creeps
right?
out.
Yeah. And like, who wants to be that guy on, Instagram being like pro-Israel? That's not cool. Like nobody wants to be that guy. So I think that part of that plays a role too. So I would say the next step is very important. Diligence. Like you gotta actually, if this is at all something that you feel like you should talk about, then it's something you got to learn about. Now, you don't have to get a PhD. It's not like this impossible task. But you got to know the gist of it, right? And be able to articulate more or less where things stand. Now, as a Christian, you have sort of two dimensions you're working. One is like the stuff we talked about earlier, the history. Like you have to know basically kind of what happened. But there's also the spiritual dimension, right? And what role does Israel play in the Christian imagination, the Christian story? That's also important. So one resource I really highly recommend to people is a movie that we made at Philos called Hope in the Holy Land. It's on Amazon Prime. It's on YouTube. It's pretty much everywhere. We're actually trying to show this film now specifically. So if there are people in your audience who are interested in showing the film and doing like Q&As and stuff like that, we can make that happen. It's a great story. It profiles a guy who starts out being like, I'm pro-Israel, but what about Palestinians? I keep hearing about these Palestinians. What's the deal with them? Is there a possibility for peace between these people? And he goes on this whole journey. It's really amazing, like street level type stuff that he does. And surprisingly, given the subject matter, the film ends exposing the humanity of both sides and a hopeful path forward. It's a great film. Like in an hour and a half, you'll learn more than probably, a college course. And it's Christian. These are all Christians. So Hope in the Holy Land, I would highly recommend that. We also at Philos have these things that it's called Pathfinder courses. They're free. They're audio courses, and they're on everything from the conflict to Islam 101, Jewish Christian relations, like all this stuff, Syrian civil war. Like we have all these courses, and it's like super deep dive. That's, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty. Discernment is the next part. So I urge everybody to go out and read as much as you can, read on both sides, but there's a certain point at which you got to stop learning and start discerning. And I think that, being informed by the Holy Spirit, it's important for us to parse some of these things and come to some conclusions. It can't just be, well, they're both right.
Right.
And be able to articulate your position after that process and then action. So the one thing I'll recommend, I'll stop here, is we have something at Philos, another thing called the Philos Action League. And the Philos Action League, besides its really cool name, is this really cool network of volunteers all over the country. We have like 3,000, every state, in some countries as well, outside of the U.S. Christian volunteers who agree to be like local representatives of friendship to the Jewish community. Now, you'd be surprised at where the Jewish community can be found. Everybody thinks about New York and LA and Chicago. Jews everywhere. And now more than ever, they feel alone. They feel abandoned. They're seeing these marches on American streets, American campuses, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, like, do we even have a place here? So what PAL does, Philos Action League does, is we show up physically. We have this thing we do where we bring bouquets of white roses to Jewish synagogues, community centers, schools, little handwritten note that's just, hey, I'm Robert. I'm a Christian. I'm in your neighborhood. You don't know me, but I just want to let you know you're not alone. I'm your friend, and I would love to continue the conversation. And we just did something last Thursday. We did 179 cities on the same day.
Oh, cool.
And we have thank you notes, like it'd tear you up. I mean, you'd be shocked at how a little gesture like that can go a long way. And not only just like helping Jews feel more comfortable in America, it's rectifying the poor Christian witness of our forebears.
Historically.
Right? Things have been done in the name of the cross to this people that are unspeakable. You show up with a bouquet of flowers, you are chipping away at that awful legacy one little bit at a time. So Philos Action League, it's super fun. It feels good. It's just a great thing to be part of. And it's very simple. Like you don't have to have a PhD in the conflict to show up and be like, hey, I'm Joe, would love to get to know you.
Yeah.
So really urge people to do that. It's a simple way to actually make a difference locally.
Yeah. We've all got the opportunity, especially any students who are on campus. I have that image of that girl in mind who is pleading with her, college administrator, please stop this protest, stop these chants, stop these threats against me and my people on campus. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Robert, thank you. Thank you so much for carving out some time. I'd love to maybe continue some of these conversations, and hopefully this will just be the beginning. But thank you so much for giving your time to us.
Well, I appreciate you guys highlighting this issue and having me on.
Absolutely.
Anytime.
I hope you enjoyed this unique episode of the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, where it wasn't even Dr. Jeff. It was David Stubblefield interviewing Robert Nicholson about Israel and Palestine. As Christians, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we're called to understand the times we live in. We're called to act with discernment. Let's make the most of every opportunity we have. Let's live as beacons of light in God's kingdom. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.